Okay, so the company is continuing to grow, and by September of 2013, you guys were processing 12 billion in payments annually.
Mhm.
$12 billion. In a situation like that, you guys take a small percentage, I guess, for every processing fee,
That's right.
for every process that happens.
That's right.
Do you know? Well, can you say what that percentage was?
I mean, typically, so yeah, when you pay a business with your credit card,
Mm-hmm.
they typically pay, they'll be charged 3%.
Yeah.
That money's then distributed among the banks and the payment processing networks. And so it depends on the business size, but we may make 10 cents a quarter, 50 cents per transaction. Depends on how big it is, depends on what their volume is, but it's somewhere on that range per transaction.
That's a lot when you're talking about 12 billion a year in transactions. Even a very, very tiny piece is a ton of money. What kind of revenue was Braintree making during that time before you guys got acquired?
I don't remember what we had disclosed publicly. We were doubling revenue every year.
Okay.
We were just growing like crazy.
Okay. And then on September 26th, 2013, you guys were acquired by PayPal, which at that time was still part of eBay, for $800 million.
Mm-hmm.
And from what you said in a previous interview, 300 million of that was your cut.
Mm-hmm.
How did that feel to sign that contract and then look in your bank account and you have $300 million in your bank account?
Surprisingly, like this really weird mixture of emotions. I mean, at that moment, I was depressed out of my mind. I'd been struggling with chronic depression for a decade. And I was leaving the Mormon church. I was in the middle of getting, separating from my relationship. It was complicated. I've been running myself ragged as an entrepreneur for 14 years, working my tail end off. So it would be a really nice story if I said like best moment of my life, and I started crying, and there was a sunset. But it was really complicated.
Okay.
Yeah.
You still have 300 million, even with all that stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, I have 300 million, and then money's complicated. Like it really is. And I know this is like, complain to me, cry to me on this thing. It's complicated. And so life was complicated at that moment. I'm just saying it wasn't an easy thing for me to say, best moment of my life, achievement after all this time. Certainly I was happy that it happened, but it was just amongst a bunch of emotions that were very complicated.
Was there a reason why you sold as opposed to keeping the company private and, creating multi-generational wealth for your kids? I mean, not to say that you're not already doing that, but I'm saying a company that you could potentially have your kids take over and be CEOs of and so forth.
I mean, it goes back to the goal I had when I was 21. My favorite way of learning is reading biographies. I love reading about people throughout history who in their time and place identified impossibly hard to see things and then did them. And my orientation was always that I wanted to try to do something meaningful, something that would be worth being mentioned in the history books in the year 2500. And if you put that as the threshold of what could be potentially worthy of mention in 2500, it eliminates so much noise of what happens. And payments, while important, is not going to be in the history books in a couple hundred years. It's a functional thing in society. We're glad it exists. Braintree was Braintree Venmo is now part of the global infrastructure on planet Earth, moving money around. I mean, we were so impressed. It was such a phenomenal accomplishment for all of us. That said, it wasn't why I exist. And I really wanted to get at, a pursuit of what thing could I do on this kind of time scale.
Before trying to find that pursuit, was there something that you bought, with the money once you got it? I mean, was there some crazy purchase that you've always wanted to do that you finally got a chance to do?
No.
I
know. I think I'm the most boring person ever, right? I mean, like I don't tell a spectacular story around getting the money, and I didn't go out and buy some expensive car or whatever.
So no plane, no mega mansion, no house in the south of France, none of that.
I mean, my grandfather was a significant influence on my life raising me. He grew up in the Depression. He was the most frugal person I'd ever met in my entire life. I was frugal, and those habits just don't change immediately. So no, I remained being extremely frugal.
Okay, so now you basically have more money than you could spend in your lifetime. And you start thinking about what you're going to do in your next step. Because were you offered to stay on as CEO or no? At the point that PayPal acquired you, they pretty much took over Venmo and Braintree?
That was never part of my willingness.
Okay.
The goal was to move on to do something else.
Got it.
Yeah.
So you officially stepped away. Are you happy with the way the company's turned out after you left?
I mean, it exists. It's independent. It's growing like a weed. I mean, like it's an entrepreneur's dream.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so now you start thinking about what you're going to do next. And what ultimately led you to your next step?
I thought about it I have been thinking about it for 10 years. And I like doing these thought processes where, when you go back and you read a biography of somebody in the 1600s, there's only so much information available about the 1600s or 1500s. And it probably captures it probably only captures like 1 or 2 or 5% of all the things that happened remains. Everything else is just gone. Like we have no documentation of it. And so time has this way of distilling information into things that we consider to be worthy to carry on with us as we trek about our journey. And so if you say right now in 2023, in a couple hundred years, when something's written about this time and place, what survives? And that's been my thought process is the exercise is trying to eliminate all the noise and getting to the absolute nugget of what is going on now that matters. That's what I've been trying to solve for 10 years. And I feel really good with where we're at right now with all these different things. But it's been I've never had my intellect strained like it's been in this process.
Okay. Well, you finally started to develop a plan of what you're going to do and how you're going to spend your money. And you put $54 million into Kernel. Explain what Kernel is.
A kernel is like a bike helmet you put on your head, and it measures your brain. And so the idea behind this is humans do really well when we can build things according to engineering standards. So when you buy a new washer and dryer for your home, you don't have to look at the measurements and wonder whether it's going to fit through your front door. You just know it's going to because society has built according to standards. If you buy a car, it's going to fit in the lanes on the roads. And so when we have measurement, we build standards. One of the only things we don't have measurement for humans is our minds. And so the world we've built is not based upon measurement, it's based upon the subjective feelings. And so the hypothesis was, if we are contemplating the future of the human race, if we're contemplating, we're saying artificial intelligence is progressing pretty quickly, humans, we want to evolve ourselves at some rate. If we're going to do that, we need some kind of standardized, methodical, rigorous way to measure our minds and then build society around our minds to allow us to move forward. And if you put the contrast and say, okay, well, how are we doing with our minds today? We're in this cognitive crisis. Things are pretty bad about our mental stability in the world. And so we wanted to find a technology. So we spent 2 years looking at every technology in existence. We looked at the edge of physics of everything possible we could look at. We evaluated all the technologies. We brought them all up. We tested them all. We chose one that we felt fit the criteria of it was cheap enough, it could be used around the world by everybody, and it had high quality data. And we built it. It was an impossibly hard thing to do. I think most people thought it was impossible for us to do, and we did it. And so now the device is being used in clinical studies to look at cognitive decline and depression, of trying to establish we can measure the brain and we can have a biomarker. So just like you look at your blood and you say my cholesterol is blank, and you're trying to do the same for the brain and trying to create numbers for the brain that allows to start doing things in a methodical way.
Okay. So, for example, something like CTE. Usually when football players die, some of them devote their brains to science. They cut open their skull and they slice up their brains and they say, oh, okay, this guy, had really bad CTE. And, this is probably the reason why he ended up in prison and everything else like that. Are you saying you could do this without actually cutting open a brain with your technology, or is it a little bit different?
Yeah, it's the same idea. Basically, why do we wait for someone to die to look at their brain?
Yeah.
Let's do it now. Let's do it in this chair right now, you in your chair right now, anyone, before practice, after practice, whenever, now. And that was the whole goal, is if we can measure our minds, our brains, we may play sports differently. We may do recovery differently. We may do social media differently. We may do politics differently. We may have depression meds differently. We may do everything differently. And that was the idea, is that this measuring the brain might rescaffold society around our brain.
So can you actually detect CTE in a living person with your helmet, basically?
I don't know the studies on that.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, and wasn't Parkinson's one of the things that you guys were looking at?
We are looking at cognitive decline,
Mhm.
and we're looking at depression. So we're trying to find patterns in the brain. Like, for example, we just did a study with alcohol. So we had placebo, low, and medium alcohol. And so when someone did low alcohol, they became impaired, but their brain could compensate for it. So when they did behavioral measures, they appeared absolutely normal. When we looked at the brain with our device, we could tell they were impaired, but the brain compensates for it. If you put them on a higher amount of alcohol, it becomes too much for the brain to compensate for, and their impairment is shown in their behavioral measures. So we showed our device could identify impairment before with better accuracy than behavioral measures. And that's the whole thing, is these things in our brain hide themselves from us.
Uh-huh.
Same with cognitive decline. Like, people can be having cognitive decline for decades, and then it shows up with symptoms, but it's been going on for decades.
Okay.
So how do you find things, like the same thing with the football players? Like, how do you find something going on now before it's a problem? And how do you find these patterns? And so that was the whole idea, is everywhere in society, if I have onset of depression, if there's such a thing as, like, I have a progressive path towards some kind of condition, could I catch it in an earlier state before it, gets worse? These are the questions we want to start asking.
Yeah, I mean, my dad died of Parkinson's, and it was rough to see it,
Yeah.
because, he was there completely in terms of his
Yeah.
intelligence, but his body stopped working with his brain. I
Yeah.
mean, he couldn't breathe himself, by himself at one
Yeah.
point. He needed a breathing tube, and, he needed assistance, and, like his arms
Yeah.
and legs weren't working as well. And it was rough. It was one of the hardest things I went through.
Same. I mean, my stepfather is going through cognitive decline, and there's just nothing worse than watching him lose his humanhood
Yeah.
before your very eyes.
Right.
It's devastating.